Today, your story is The Tale of Peter Rabbit, and it's by Beatrix Potter. And before we get started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Beatrix Potter because she was born a very long time ago, and she loved fairy tales and folk tales, and she even wrote her own versions of Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty. And when Beatrix Potter was alive, there were no cars or computers or telephones, and people used letters to communicate to each other. And Beatrix Potter started picturing stories in her mind that included her pets. And she began writing these stories down in letters to children that she knew. And then she ended up putting all of her letters together to create her first book called The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Now, our story today is from the genre fantasy. Now, fantasy means that the people, the animals, the objects, they can do things that they really can't do in the real world. So it couldn't really happen. And the story takes place in a make-believe place. Before we read, I do want to talk about a couple of vocabulary words. One is going to be the word shed, which means to let fall. Someone shed their jacket and let it fall to the ground. And then the other one is sieve. And a sieve is a garden tool that strains something, like strains the dirt out. So those are the two vocabulary words that we're going to focus on today. Before we read, I want to tell you the essential question is I want you to be thinking about what can happen when we do not follow rules. All right, so let's talk about the tale of Peter Rabbit. There are no illustrations for this one, so you just have to kind of listen. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden." Then Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the woods to the baker's. Okay, so far we know that this is a fantasy. What about this makes it a fantasy? What are these rabbits doing that they can't really do? They're talking, right? Rabbits can't talk in real life. So just in a fantasy, animals can do things that they can't do in real life. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was a very naughty bunny, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. And then, feeling rather sick, he went back to look for some parsley. But whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. Then he ran into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost, and he shed big tears. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop upon the top of Peter, but Peter wiggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind. Okay, so we just heard our 2 vocabulary words. He shed big tears. He let them drop. Those tears are running down his face. And then the other one was sieve. And remember, let's look at that picture again. Mr. McGregor had a sieve, and he was going to turn it over and try to trap Peter in that sieve. He rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can full of water. Peter sneezed. Kerchoo! Mr. McGregor was after him in no time. Peter jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time, he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking all around. Peter began to cry. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of the hoe, scritch, scratch, scratch, scritch. Peter climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Peter never stopped running until he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and gave him some chamomile tea. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk with blackberries for supper. All right, so your essential question was, what can happen when you don't follow the rules? Well, a lot of things happened to him, right? He got sick because he ate so much food that he shouldn't have eaten. He got chased by Mr. McGregor, and that could have gone very badly. He could have gotten hurt or worse. And then because he jumped into that watering can and got all cold and wet, he was sick that evening. So there were a lot of things that happened because he didn't follow the rules. Now, I will include the discussion starters so you can talk some more with your big person about the tale of Peter Rabbit.